Right now, somewhere in the world, a group of people is experiencing symptoms that doctors can't explain. Real symptoms, genuine suffering, tremors, paralysis, seizures, pain. The tests come back normal. The scans show nothing. And yet, the symptoms spread from person to person like wildfire. This isn't a mystery. This isn't supernatural. This is mass psychogenic illness. And it's been happening for centuries. In 1518, it took the form of uncontrollable dancing that killed dozens in a prosperous European city. In 2011, it was Tourette-like symptoms spreading through a high school in upstate New York. In 2020, it was teenagers on TikTok developing tics that looked exactly like their favorite creators. The mechanism is the same. The suffering is real. And understanding how this works might be one of the most important things you learn about the human mind, because this isn't about them. This is about all of us. This is about what happens when stress, belief, and social connection collide in ways that override our conscious control. Let me show you how deep this rabbit hole goes. Let's start with what actually happens during an episode of mass psychogenic illness, because the first thing you need to understand is that this is not faking. This is not attention-seeking. This is not people choosing to behave this way. The symptoms are involuntary, the distress is genuine, and the people experiencing it are just as confused as everyone watching. Here's how it typically unfolds. It starts with one person, what researchers call the index case. This person develops symptoms that are visible, dramatic, and concerning. Maybe it's fainting. Maybe it's tremors. Maybe it's paralysis or seizures, or, in the case we're going to examine closely, uncontrollable dancing. The key is that other people witness it. And those witnesses are usually already under some form of significant stress. They're dealing with anxiety, trauma, economic hardship, social pressure, or some combination of factors that has their nervous system already running hot. When they see the index case, something fascinating happens in their brains. Their mirror neurons fire. These are the cells that help us understand and empathize with others by essentially simulating what we're seeing. You watch someone get hit, you wince. You see someone yawn, you yawn. You observe someone having what looks like a medical crisis, and your brain starts modeling what that would feel like. For most people, this stays at the level of empathy and concern. But for people who are already psychologically vulnerable, who already have high levels of anxiety or unprocessed trauma, that simulation can become activation. The symptoms aren't chosen. They emerge from the same place that panic attacks come from, or conversion disorders, or psychosomatic pain. The mind, overwhelmed by stress it can't process consciously, expresses that stress through the body. And because humans are profoundly social creatures, because we're wired to pick up on and resonate with the emotional and physical states of those around us, those symptoms can spread through a community like a virus. Not a biological virus, a psychological one, but just as real in its effects. What makes mass psychogenic illness particularly fascinating to researchers is that it follows predictable patterns. It tends to occur in closed or semi-closed communities where people are in regular contact with each other. Schools, workplaces, religious communities, military units. It requires a certain level of stress or anxiety already present in the population. And crucially, it requires a culturally available explanation for the symptoms. The form the symptoms take isn't random. It maps onto existing beliefs, fears, or models of illness that are already present in that culture. And that's where our story from 1518 becomes so illuminating. Because what happened in Strasbourg that summer wasn't just a bizarre historical anomaly. It was a textbook case of mass psychogenic illness that shows us exactly how this phenomenon works when all the conditions align. July 15th, 1518. A woman steps into the street in Strasbourg and begins to dance. No music, no festival, just dancing. Violent, aggressive movements, arms flailing, feet stamping, her body moving as though it's being controlled by something outside herself. Days pass. She's still dancing. Within a week, she's been joined by 36 others. By the end of the month, possibly 400 people are caught in this dancing frenzy. Some will die from exhaustion, heart attacks, and strokes. Now, before we dive into what was really happening, let's understand something crucial about Strasbourg in 1518. This was not some backwards medieval village full of superstitious peasants. This was one of the most sophisticated cities in Europe. It had universities. It had a renowned medical school. It had a thriving merchant class, skilled physicians, and educated citizens who could read and write. The people who started dancing weren't ignorant. They were artisans, housewives, merchants, even members of prominent families. So we can't dismiss this as primitive ignorance. These were people like us, caught in circumstances that overwhelmed their capacity to cope. Let's talk about those circumstances, because this is where it gets really interesting. The winter of 1517 had been catastrophic. Crops froze in the fields. By spring, grain prices had tripled. The city's orphanages were overflowing, not with orphans, but with children whose parents couldn't feed them and had surrendered them, hoping they'd at least survive. The poor were mixing sawdust into their bread just to have something that felt like sustenance. One contemporary chronicler summed it up with just 2 words: bad year. But starvation was only part of the pressure. Syphilis had recently appeared in Europe, and unlike the plague, which killed quickly, syphilis was a slow horror. Bodies rotting from the inside out over months and years, noses collapsing, bones dissolving, flesh covered in weeping sores. The clergy declared it God's punishment for sin, and there was no cure, no treatment, no hope if you contracted it, just the knowledge that you would slowly decay until death finally came. The political situation was equally apocalyptic. The Holy Roman Empire was fracturing. Just 1 year earlier, Martin Luther had nailed his 95 Theses to a church door, igniting the Protestant Reformation. The religious certainties that had structured society for centuries were suddenly in question. In the countryside around Strasbourg, peasant uprisings had been brutally crushed. Bodies hung from trees along the main roads as warnings. The social contract between rulers and ruled was dissolving. And then there were the environmental factors. Strange weather patterns that people interpreted as signs of the apocalypse. Harsh winters followed by scorching summers. Hailstorms in August destroying what little remained of the crops. Blood-red sunsets that lingered for hours, probably from volcanic ash in the atmosphere, though they didn't know that. To the people of Strasbourg, it looked like the end times. Now here's what made Strasbourg particularly vulnerable. The city sat at the heart of what historians call the St. Vitus Corridor, a region along the Rhine and Moselle rivers where outbreaks of dancing mania had been occurring periodically for centuries. The last major one had been in 1474, when thousands of people across the region had danced uncontrollably for weeks. The people of Strasbourg knew these stories. They'd grown up with them. Every child learned that St. Vitus, if angered, could curse you to dance until you died. There were paintings in the churches showing sinners dancing in hellish processions. There was a shrine to St. Vitus just 10 miles away, where victims of the dancing curse supposedly went to be cured. So when that first woman began dancing, when Frau Trophäa lurched into the street and couldn't stop, the people watching had a ready explanation. This wasn't a seizure. This wasn't heat stroke. This was the curse of St. Vitus. They knew what it was because they'd been culturally primed their entire lives to recognize it. And that cultural framework, that shared belief system, became the lens through which the entire crisis was understood, and crucially, through which it spread. But here's a detail that often gets left out of the retellings, and it's absolutely critical to understanding what really happened. 3 days before Frau Trophäa started dancing, the Strasbourg City Council had passed a new ordinance banning begging in the streets. Anyone caught asking for alms would be branded and expelled from the city. For the growing population of desperate, starving citizens, this was essentially a death sentence. Contemporary records show that on July 12th, 3 days before the dancing began, a crowd of beggars gathered at the cathedral to protest. They were dispersed by force, and according to a document discovered in the Vatican archives in the 1990s, among that crowd was a woman matching Frau Troffea's description. Think about what that means. A desperate woman, possibly starving, certainly traumatized, watches as her last hope for survival is violently crushed. 3 days later, her body begins to move in ways she cannot control. A movement that looks like protest, like rage, like the physical expression of an anguish too profound for words. Was this really a supernatural curse? Or was Frau Troffea's body speaking a language her voice couldn't access? Now let's talk about how this situation went from bad to catastrophic, because what happened next is a masterclass in how well-intentioned interventions can amplify a psychological contagion. The city's physicians were called in. Remember, these weren't village healers working with folk remedies. This was one of the most respected medical faculties in Europe. They examined the dancers and came to a diagnosis based on the best scientific knowledge of their time. Their conclusion: the dancers were suffering from overheated blood. Their humors were imbalanced. The heat had risen to their brains, creating a kind of fever that manifested as uncontrollable movement. Now to us, this sounds absurd. But within the framework of humoral medicine, which was the dominant medical paradigm for centuries, this made perfect sense. And more importantly, it led to a treatment protocol that followed a certain internal logic. If the dancing was caused by excess heat and energy that needed to be expelled, then the cure was to let that energy burn itself out. The dancers needed to dance more, not less, but they needed to do it properly, with music and rhythm to help regulate their movements and eventually exhaust the fever. On August 3rd, the City Council put this plan into action. They cleared out 2 guild halls and the grain market. They built a stage in the horse market. They hired the best musicians in the city: drums, pipes, fiddles. They even hired strong men to act as dance partners, to hold the dancers upright when they began to collapse, to keep them moving. Think about what this must have looked like. The most public spaces in the city, converted into dancing platforms, musicians playing continuously, and the dancers themselves, bloody feet leaving red prints on the wood, faces gaunt and vacant, bodies convulsing in movements that looked more like agony than celebration. And everyone in the city had to walk past these stages multiple times a day. You couldn't avoid seeing it. Every trip to market, every errand, every journey through the city centre meant confronting this spectacle of bodies moving beyond exhaustion, beyond pain, beyond any recognizable human control. This might have been the worst possible response. Not because the authorities were cruel or stupid, but because they fundamentally misunderstood what they were dealing with. They thought they were treating a physical illness. What they were actually doing was amplifying a psychological contagion. Every person who walked past those stages and saw the dancers, every citizen who watched bodies twisting and feet bleeding and faces frozen in that vacant stare, was forced to confront their own vulnerability, their own fears, their own guilt about whatever sins they believed might have brought this curse upon the city. The visibility of the dancers created a kind of feedback loop. The more people saw it, the more they thought about it. The more they thought about it, the more they dwelled on their own potential susceptibility. And dwelling on the possibility that you might start dancing uncontrollably is a lot like being told not to think about a pink elephant. The mind rebels. Suddenly, that's all you can think about. The stages meant to contain the plague became its primary amplification mechanism. By the second week of August, instead of burning out, the dancing was spreading faster than ever. The stages had become magnets for new victims. People would come to watch, and within minutes find themselves compelled to join in. One particularly detailed account describes a wealthy merchant's daughter who had come to bring water to the afflicted as an act of Christian charity. As she approached the platform, her body began to shake. She dropped the water jug, which shattered. Her arms flew up, as if pulled by invisible strings. Within moments, she was dancing as frantically as the rest. Her father tried to restrain her, called her name, grabbed her arms, but she looked through him as if he wasn't there. Not everyone who joined did so involuntarily. Some people, driven to desperation by hunger and hopelessness, threw themselves into the dance deliberately. They saw it as a form of religious ecstasy or penance. If St. Vitus was punishing the city, they reasoned, then perhaps by joining the dance voluntarily, they could appease him. But voluntary or not, once you started dancing, you couldn't stop. The compulsion was total. By mid-August, with possibly 400 people now caught in the dance, the city council finally reversed course. The stages were torn down. The musicians were sent home. A total ban on all public music and dancing was declared. Even wedding celebrations couldn't have music louder than a single flute. But more importantly, they changed their diagnosis. This wasn't a natural disease after all. This was divine punishment. And the only cure was to take the dancers to the shrine of St. Vitus in Saverne, 10 miles away. The logistics of transporting 400 people who couldn't stop dancing 10 miles over rural roads was staggering. The dancers were loaded into wagons, their arms and legs bound to prevent them from injuring themselves or others. The journey took days, with the procession stopping frequently to rest the horses and tend to dancers who had collapsed. When they finally arrived at the shrine in Saverne, they were led into a small grotto chapel for a ritual unlike anything in standard Catholic practice. This was folk religion, ancient and strange, tolerated by the church but never fully embraced. Each dancer was given a small cross to hold and had tiny red shoes placed on their feet. Not real shoes, symbolic ones, no bigger than a child's finger. These shoes were blessed with holy water and marked with crosses in holy oil. Then came the crucial part. The dancers were led in a choreographed procession around a wooden statue of St. Vitus. This was still dancing, but controlled, ritualized dancing. They moved in a circle, priests chanting in Latin, incense thick in the air. The idea was to transform their chaotic, cursed dance into a holy dance, to redirect the energy from demonic to divine. And according to multiple witnesses, it worked. One by one, the dancers began to slow. Their movements became less frantic. Some collapsed, not from exhaustion this time, but from release. They wept, they prayed, they slept, and when they woke, the compulsion to dance was gone. Word was sent back to Strasbourg. St. Vitus had forgiven them. By September, the plague was over. Now here's what's absolutely critical to understand about this resolution. The cure worked not because there was anything supernatural about those red shoes or that shrine or those prayers. The cure worked because the people believed it would work. Remember, the same psychological mechanism that created the dancing plague also ended it. The mind, given a culturally acceptable framework for release, for resolution, for cure, could allow the body to stop. The ritual provided what the dancers' nervous systems desperately needed: permission to let go. Think about the journey to Saverne from the dancers' perspective. For weeks, they'd been trapped in their bodies, unable to stop moving, unable to explain what was happening to them. Everyone around them had theories. Demonic possession, divine punishment, medical fever, but nothing had worked. And then they're taken on this pilgrimage. They're told they're going to the one place that can cure them. The journey itself becomes a liminal space, a transition from curse to cure. By the time they arrive, they're primed for healing. They expect it. They need it. And when the ritual begins, when they're given those symbolic red shoes and told to dance one final time, but this time in a holy way, their minds finally have permission to release the compulsion. This is the power of ritual, of belief, of cultural frameworks for understanding and resolving psychological distress. The symptoms were real. The suffering was genuine. But both the cause and the cure existed in that fascinating space where mind and body intersect, where belief becomes biology, where culture shapes physiology in ways we're only beginning to understand. So that's what happened in Strasbourg in 1518. But here's why this matters now, in the 21st century. Because mass psychogenic illness didn't stop in the Middle Ages. It didn't disappear with the Enlightenment or get cured by modern medicine. It's still happening. The specific symptoms change based on cultural context, but the underlying mechanism remains the same. And in our hyper-connected age, where social contagion can spread at the speed of internet, understanding this phenomenon has never been more important. Let me give you some modern examples that will sound eerily familiar. In 1962, workers at a textile factory in the United States became convinced they were being bitten by a mysterious bug. Dozens developed real welts and rashes. The factory was shut down. Exterminators were called in. Entomologists examined every inch of the facility. No bug was ever found. The symptoms were real. The bug wasn't. The workers, mostly women in a high-stress, low-control work environment, were experiencing mass psychogenic illness. Their bodies were expressing distress their minds couldn't articulate. In 2011, in the small town of Leroy, New York, a teenage girl developed tics and verbal outbursts that looked exactly like Tourette syndrome. Within weeks, 18 other students, mostly teenage girls who were friends or knew each other, developed the same symptoms. Neurologists were baffled. The tests showed nothing. Environmental investigators checked for toxins. Nothing. What they eventually realized was that these girls, many of whom knew each other well, were experiencing mass psychogenic illness. The symptoms spread through their social network, the same way the dancing spread through Strasbourg. Through observation, through stress, through the brain's mirror neurons, creating a feedback loop of symptom modeling and activation. But here's where it gets really interesting for our current moment. Starting around 2019 and accelerating through 2020 and 2021, neurologists around the world started seeing an explosion of cases of teenagers, primarily teenage girls, developing sudden-onset tic disorders. Not gradual Tourette syndrome that develops in childhood, but sudden dramatic tics that appeared almost overnight. And these tics looked remarkably similar across different patients. Specific movements, specific vocalizations. The neurologists were confused until they started asking a simple question. What do these patients have in common? The answer, TikTok. These teenagers had been watching TikTok creators who had Tourette syndrome and documented their tics. Some of these creators had millions of followers, and the teenagers who developed symptoms had been watching these videos, sometimes for hours a day. Their mirror neurons were firing, modeling these movements over and over. And for those who were already struggling with anxiety, depression, isolation, the stress of the pandemic, those modeled movements could become activated. Their bodies started producing tics that looked remarkably like the tics they'd been watching. Not because they were faking, not because they were attention-seeking, but because that's how mass psychogenic illness works in the age of social media. The mechanism is identical to Strasbourg's. An index case demonstrates symptoms. Vulnerable individuals observe and model those symptoms. Stress and anxiety prime the nervous system to convert observation into activation. The symptoms spread through social networks. The suffering is genuine. But the cause is psychological, not biological. Or rather, it's the point where psychology becomes biology, where the mind's distress manifests in the body in ways that are completely involuntary and completely real. And here's what makes the TikTok cases particularly illuminating. Unlike Strasbourg, where everyone shared the same physical space and the same cultural framework, these teenagers were spread across different countries, different time zones, different cultures. What they shared was a digital space. Their community was online. The social contagion spread not through physical proximity, but through screens, through algorithms that kept showing them similar content. through the parasocial relationships they'd formed with creators they'd never met in person. The village has become global, but the mechanism remains the same. So what do we do with this information? How do we think about mass psychogenic illness in a way that respects the reality of the suffering while understanding the mechanism? Because here's what's crucial. Knowing that something is psychogenic doesn't make it less real. It doesn't mean people are faking. It doesn't mean they can just stop. The symptoms are as real as if they had a biological cause. The distress is genuine. The loss of voluntary control is complete. What changes is how we approach treatment and prevention. The Strasbourg case teaches us several critical lessons. First, visibility amplifies contagion. When the authorities built those stages in the most public parts of the city, they turned the dancing plague into a spectacle that everyone had to confront multiple times a day. In our modern context, this translates directly to media coverage and social media sharing. When we broadcast cases of mass psychogenic illness widely, when we create viral content around unusual symptoms, we risk creating the very feedback loop that drives spread. This doesn't mean we should ignore or suppress these cases, but it means we need to be thoughtful about how we discuss them. Focus on the mechanism rather than the specific symptoms. Explain the psychology without sensationalizing the behavior. Give people frameworks for understanding without giving them blueprints for replication. Second, the cure requires addressing the underlying stress, not just the surface symptoms. The dancing didn't stop because the dancers got more rest or better nutrition, although those things certainly would have helped. It stopped when they were given a culturally acceptable framework for release, a ritual that allowed their nervous systems to let go of the compulsion. In modern treatment of mass psychogenic illness, this translates to creating environments where people feel safe, understood, and empowered. Cognitive behavioral therapy, stress reduction, community support. These are the equivalents of the pilgrimage to Saverne. Third, and perhaps most importantly, we need to recognize that susceptibility to psychogenic illness isn't a weakness. It's a feature of how human nervous systems work, particularly in people with high empathy, strong mirror, neuron activation, and deep social connection. The people who develop these symptoms aren't broken or flawed. They're people whose bodies are trying to communicate distress in the only language available to them when conscious verbal expression has failed. The dancing plague of 1518 happened because a community under extreme stress, primed by cultural beliefs and lacking other outlets for their distress, developed a form of mass psychogenic illness that manifested as uncontrollable dancing. The symptoms spread through observation and social connection. Well-intentioned authorities made it worse by amplifying visibility. And it only ended when the community was given a ritual framework for release that aligned with their cultural beliefs about the cause. 500 years later, the specifics have changed, but the mechanism remains. We're still social creatures whose nervous systems can become entrained to those around us. We're still vulnerable to converting psychological distress into physical symptoms when we lack other outlets. We're still capable of spreading symptoms through communities when the conditions align. The village is now digital. The symptoms map onto contemporary concerns rather than medieval saints. But underneath, we're the same species, with the same beautiful, terrifying capacity for our minds to override our conscious control and make our bodies do things we never chose. Understanding this isn't about dismissing or diminishing the reality of mass psychogenic illness. It's about recognizing it as a profound expression of human psychology, of how deeply interconnected we are, of how much our minds and bodies influence each other in ways that transcend our conscious awareness. Those dancers in 1518 weren't primitive or ignorant. They were people like us, caught in circumstances that overwhelmed their capacity to cope. Their bodies danced because their minds could find no other way to express what they were experiencing. The stages have been torn down. The music has stopped. But in the space between mind and body, between belief and behavior, between individual psychology and social contagion. The dance continues, not as a medieval curiosity, but as an ongoing reminder of how much we still have to learn about consciousness, about social connection, about the remarkable, sometimes terrifying ways that being human means we're never quite as in control as we think we are. Thanks for watching. If you found value in this video, please hit the like button. It really helps the channel. And if you want to see more, check out this video right here. See you in the next one.